All right, so the life habits of early insects. We think insects were terrestrial at first, and then they moved back into the water, but there's considerable debate about this, and we may never know what's right, but there's evidence for that. Some of the earliest insects we think were possibly predatory or maybe detritivorous. There was a lot of detritus that needed to be like processed and eaten, so it would have been kind of a niche that would have been open to insects. We can talk about these insects and invertebrates based on their functional feeding guild. So are they grazing and scraping algae? Are they shredding detrital material? Are they collecting little bits of things or gathering little bits of, feces and bits of particulate matter and plants? Are they filtering things out of the water column, or are they predators? And when we're thinking about the evolution of these organisms, at the same time that we're thinking about the geologic time scale, we should be thinking about plate tectonics. So here's an image, again, showing the rainbow of time, but we're showing you what the planet looked like at that time. So here's when the insects came about. When the insects came about, all the continents were combined into the supercontinent, with Laurentia in the north and Gondwana to the south, and the climate was mild. Then, by the time the plants came onto the scene, the continents were starting to split apart. Okay, Pangea had broken apart. And so what's interesting is to think about these things both happening through evolutionary time and through space as these plates are shifting, right? And so I think that there's a lot that we can kind of understand about evolution by trying to put it into the context of plate tectonics. We can also think about these extinction events. So there were two major extinction events that occurred when Pangea was complete, right? And so maybe that had something to do with why the extinction events were so massive, is that there weren't separate places kind of for organisms to hide. Okay, so the habitats of aquatic insects, anywhere there's water, you'll find them, right? Even salty water, water with no oxygen, boiling water, freezing water. We have extremophiles everywhere. There's flowing water, there's standing water, there's wetlands, okay? We're gonna talk about all of these things, groundwater, marine environments, and even some man-made aquatic environments. So we'll talk about each of these things briefly. So we do have extremophile aquatic organisms like Polypetalum vanderplanki, which is a chironomid, a true fly larvae that can basically survive desiccation in these little pools in Africa. We also have a nematode called Panagrolaemus davidi that can survive freezing in Antarctica. So it can almost freeze completely. It has protective sugars that keep it from undergoing major damage. So two different extremophiles, one fly larva, one roundworm, living in two totally different extreme environments. Streams and rivers are called lotic environments for flowing water. Stoneflies in particular like flowing cold water, so you only really find them when conditions are really clean and cold and relatively pristine. Most aquatic organisms in streams live on the bottom of flowing water in what's called the benthos, and they have adaptations to swift flowing water and burrowing down into the mud. They tend to avoid the thalaweg, which is the place in the stream that's moving the swiftest, and they live on the margins of the stream. They also can burrow down into what's called the hypereic zone, and they can live in temporary streams, salty streams, and geothermal streams. The hypereic zone is the zone underneath the stream that's saturated and can extend for many meters beyond where you see the water itself. It's this permeable layer, and it's basically like it acts as a coolant or refrigerator and kind of an archive or storage space for organisms that burrow down in here to get out of the way of floods and things. Lakes and ponds are called lentic environments. There are different words for lakes like mares and terns and lochs and lochans. Along rivers where a meandering bend gets cut off, you can create what's called an oxbow lake or a billabong. They're called billabongs in Australia. And then kettle lakes, we have a few of them around us, are where a big chunk of glacial ice was dropped by the glacier, and then rock was piled around it, and as the ice melted, it left just this neat little hole in the ground. In lakes, you have surface dwellers because the water's calm. You can have things like water striders. You also have organisms living on the bottom, the benthos, but you have very few aquatic organisms that live their whole lives in the water column. That's more for phytoplankton and zooplankton and fish and things. There are very few deep water dwellers, but I did talk about a few of those organisms that live deep in Lake Baikal and Lake Tahoe. And lakes have issues with stratification and freezing, and so organisms have to deal with those conditions. There are also organisms that live in salt lakes, acidic lakes, and alkaline lakes. They can withstand all kinds of weird water chemistry. Here you can see a picture of what are called meromictic lakes. A lot of these are alkaline. You can see we have a ton of them up where we live. If you go to eastern Washington, you can find these really cool soda lakes that were formed following the formation of the channelized scablands. And they actually have pools of fossil water like at the bottom of the lake. And they have really cool, interesting chemistry that causes what's called a chemocline, in addition to the thermocline created by thermal stratification. Here's some pictures of some of these meromictic lakes, like Lake Tanganyika, Soap Lake in Washington, and Pink Lake in Australia. And then we have wetlands and springs, a lot of organic material and dissolved nutrients. Peat bogs can be nutrient poor and acidic. Wetlands can be made up of bogs, ponds, swamps, marshes, wet meadows, vernal pools, and river channels. So there's this complexity in wetland systems. Springs are often really mineral rich. Hot springs, of course, can have temperature issues that organisms have to deal with. And then kind of related to wetlands, in a sense, because there are these little pools of standing water, are phytotelmata. Basically, they're pools of water that are found in plants. Here you can see in the roots of a tree, in a bromeliad, in a skunk cabbage, right? And these can be really interesting aquatic habitats for insects. Then we have insects that live only in the groundwater. They're called stygophyta, stygofauna, and most of them are beetles. But this is a really interesting area because they're not well studied. You can imagine it's hard to get down there and find them, but there's probably a lot of discoveries to be made in the stygofauna. We can find subterranean estuaries where there's salt water that's intruded, and some Australian species have been isolated in these habitats for millions of years. So some really cool stuff happening, again, below ground. And then we have marine and estuarine. There are some aquatic insects in marine environments, very few. Most of them are freshwater, which is why this is a freshwater ecology class along with aquatic entomology. There are lots of marine invertebrates, but not very many marine insects. Okay, but we do have in intertidal mudflats and tide pools, we have some dipterans, some hemipterans, some coleopterans, and some lepidopterans. Here is a marine caddisfly. You can see it builds its cases out of corals and seaweeds, and it lays its eggs in the coelom of starfish, which is crazy. Okay, so there are a few aquatic insects in marine environments. This is an insect that lives its entire life on the surface of the sea. It's called a sea skater, okay? And it's a hemipteran, kind of like a water strider, but out on the open ocean. And then we have some artificial habitats. So canals and reservoirs, sewage lagoons, artificial wetlands, mine tailings. Here we have a fly that lives in puddles of crude oil, Hylamaya petrolei. And here we have this fly, Scitella fusca, that basically is only found growing on the wood, urine-soaked wood of outhouses. So a few adaptations to how organisms like humans have modified the environment. And with that, we're done. Thanks, guys.